Schopenhauer once wrote, "Solitude is the fate of all great minds." And perhaps he understood something that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Your nervous system is not broken. It has simply stopped mistaking strangers for allies. What society calls a problem, what your family calls concern, and what former acquaintances call isolation may actually be something far deeper taking place beneath the surface. Carl Jung described it in a completely different way. He saw it as one of the first undeniable signs that the soul had finally begun to breathe on its own. Listen carefully, because this idea is rarely explained in its true depth. Isolation is not the absence of friends. It is often the result of an excess of selfhood. It happens when the psyche has accumulated so much of its own substance, so much of its own reality, that it can no longer fit comfortably inside the collective molds where it once belonged, without resistance. You are not shrinking away from the world. In many cases, you have simply outgrown the structures that once defined you. And because of that, something subtle begins to happen. People drift away. Invitations become less frequent. Conversations that once felt natural now seem exhausting. Without anyone openly admitting it, you find yourself standing at a distance from circles that once felt familiar. What you are about to understand is not clinical advice. It is a philosophical and psychological exploration inspired by Carl Jung's understanding of the human soul. We are speaking about the psyche as a living spiritual reality, not merely as a collection of symptoms to be analyzed in an office. And the truth is not always comforting. Jung recognized something that many people instinctively fear. He saw that, at a certain stage of development, the soul must separate itself from what no longer serves it, not gradually, not politely, not in a way that leaves everyone comfortable. Sometimes it must cut ties with old patterns, old identities, and old dependencies. He did not view this process as loneliness. He saw it as a form of inner hygiene, a silent operation that separates a viable individual from the collective forces that were attempting to absorb and define them. Because the collective does absorb. This is one of the most important ideas to understand, not merely intellectually, but at the deepest level of experience. During decades of observation, Jung noticed a phenomenon that many preferred to ignore. Human beings often become trapped within what could be described as a psychological mass, a force larger than themselves that influences their thoughts, emotions, and decisions without their awareness. This psychological mass behaves in a way that is surprisingly similar to a living organism. It feeds on attention, it feeds on conformity, it feeds on emotional investment. It requires individuals to continuously contribute energy in the form of loyalty, agreement, participation, and identification. And what does it offer in return? It offers belonging. It offers the comforting illusion that your value comes from being recognized and approved by others. It offers the warmth of the crowd, the safety of shared opinions, and the reassurance that comes from moving in the same direction as everyone else. Most importantly, it offers a borrowed identity, a ready-made definition of who you are, what you should believe, and how you should live. But every borrowed identity comes with a cost. The more you depend on it, the more you must sacrifice pieces of yourself to maintain it. Every time your authentic thoughts conflict with the expectations of the group, a payment is demanded. Every time your inner voice points in a different direction, another payment is required. Gradually, without noticing, you begin exchanging your individuality for acceptance. Eventually, the soul grows tired of the transaction. Imagine a tree that has spent years supporting branches that no longer bear fruit. From a distance, those branches appear to be part of the tree. They seem valuable simply because they are attached to it. Yet, in reality, they consume resources without contributing anything in return. Nature is uncompromising about such things. When winter approaches, the tree begins a process of conservation. It withdraws its life force from the branches that no longer serve its survival. The sap stops flowing, the connection weakens. The branches dry out and eventually fall to the ground. To an observer, this might appear tragic, but the tree is not dying. It is becoming stronger. What falls away was never essential to its future growth. In biological terms, this is not destruction. It is intelligent adaptation. The tree is preserving what matters most. Something remarkably similar happens within the human psyche. There comes a moment when your inner life begins withdrawing energy from relationships, habits, environments, and identities that no longer nourish your growth. You stop forcing conversations that feel empty. You stop chasing approval from people who do not truly see you. You stop participating in roles that require you to betray yourself. And when those connections begin to weaken, you hear a sound. Most people call that sound loneliness. But perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps it is the sound of dead branches falling. Perhaps it is the sound of an outdated identity breaking apart. Perhaps it is the sound of your psyche cleaning itself, removing emotional structures that once served a purpose but can no longer accompany you into the next stage of your development. Of course it hurts. Every meaningful transformation carries pain. Every transition from one version of yourself to another requires a period of uncertainty. The mistake is assuming that all pain means something is wrong. There is the pain of injury, and there is the pain of healing. The first weakens you, the second rebuilds you. Many people confuse the two because both are uncomfortable, yet they are fundamentally different experiences. The pain of injury drains life from you. The pain of growth demands that you release what can no longer remain. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, inevitably involves periods of separation. Not because human connection is unimportant, but because authentic connection cannot exist until you know yourself apart from the crowd. The person who fears solitude often becomes dependent on external validation. The person who learns to endure solitude discovers an inner authority that cannot be taken away. This is why so many transformative periods begin with withdrawal, not as punishment, not as failure, but as preparation. The soul retreats into silence for the same reason a seed disappears beneath the soil. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening. Yet beneath the surface, an entirely new structure is forming. So if you find yourself walking through a season where old relationships are fading, where familiar environments no longer resonate, and where your inner world feels louder than the noise around you, do not rush to assume that something has gone wrong. You may simply be witnessing a natural stage of psychological growth. You may be standing at the threshold between the person you were conditioned to be and the person you were always meant to become. And that threshold is rarely crowded. Most people turn back before they reach it. Those who continue forward often discover that what felt like isolation was actually liberation, and what seemed like loss was the beginning of a deeper, more authentic life. Carl Jung once wrote, in one of the lesser-known passages associated with the spirit of the Red Book, an idea that deserves to be reflected upon more than once. He suggested that the person who turns inward truly begins to awaken, and that the path of awakening is, by its very nature, a solitary one. Every individual must forge their own sense of legitimacy from within, without applause, without constant validation, and without an audience standing by to confirm that they exist. That last point is especially important. Most people live within a psychological agreement that operates through mutual validation. I acknowledge your existence, and you acknowledge mine. We support one another through this constant exchange of recognition, and as long as nobody questions the arrangement, everyone feels secure. Everyone feels real. But the moment an individual decides that their existence no longer depends on being confirmed by others, something shifts. The unspoken contract begins to break apart. Suddenly, the person who stands on their own is viewed with suspicion. They are called distant, strange, cold, detached, or antisocial. They are treated as if something must be wrong with them. Why? Because they have done something that many people unconsciously consider unacceptable. They have stopped depending on the collective mirror. And this brings us to something few people ever discuss about emotionally empty lives. People do not necessarily resent you because of what you do. More often, they resent you because of what your existence reveals. Every time they encounter someone who can be alone without falling apart, someone who can sit with themselves without panic, someone who does not desperately seek distraction, approval, or constant conversation, they are confronted with an uncomfortable reality. For a brief moment, they become aware of a void they have spent years trying to avoid. It feels like a crack appearing beneath the surface, a quiet internal disturbance, a reminder that they may not know how to exist without external stimulation. Many people cannot tolerate that realization for very long. The discomfort is too intense. Instead of facing it, they direct their attention toward the person who triggered it. The messenger becomes the target. This is why independent people are often misunderstood. Rumors emerge, judgments appear, exclusion happens silently, criticism seems to come from nowhere. But very often, the reaction is not truly about the independent person at all. It is about what they reflect. When someone stands firmly in their own psychological sovereignty, they become a mirror, and mirrors can be threatening, not because they attack, but because they reveal. Simply by existing comfortably within yourself, you expose possibilities that others may have never developed. You demonstrate a level of inner stability that cannot be purchased, borrowed, or faked. To a person who has never begun the journey of self-discovery, this can feel deeply unsettling. Jung repeatedly emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, is rarely welcomed by those who remain identified with the crowd. The individual who begins to separate from collective expectations often appears threatening, even when they are doing nothing harmful. Your peace becomes disturbing. Your independence becomes offensive. Your silence becomes provocative. Not because you are actively trying to challenge anyone, but because your presence forces others to confront questions they have spent years avoiding. A fully developed individual and a person completely absorbed by the crowd can often be distinguished by one simple ability. The individuated person can sit alone with themselves for hours and remain at peace. The person who has never developed an inner relationship with themselves often cannot. Within minutes, they reach for their phone. They search for messages. They open social media. They turn on a screen. They call someone. They look for noise, entertainment, or distraction. Anything to fill the space. Anything to avoid the silence. Because silence is not frightening when you know yourself. Silence becomes frightening when you do not. For the person who has never explored their inner world, silence is a doorway. And beyond that doorway waits a terrifying possibility, the realization that they have spent their entire lives building an identity around external reactions rather than inner substance. That is the deeper tragedy. People do not become emotionally empty because they consciously choose emptiness. Most become empty because they never learned how to inhabit themselves. They never cultivated an inner life strong enough to sustain them when the crowd disappeared. As a result, they depend on others to provide what they cannot generate internally. Their sense of worth, meaning, excitement, and identity must constantly come from outside. Relationships then begin to change their function. Friendship is no longer friendship. Companionship is no longer companionship. Instead, other people become psychological life support systems. The relationship exists not because two whole individuals freely choose one another, but because one person needs the other to fill an internal absence. And perhaps, without realizing it, you spent years serving that role for many people. You became the source of emotional energy they could not generate themselves. You listened endlessly. You reassured constantly. You carried burdens that were never yours to carry. You provided understanding, attention, encouragement, and psychological oxygen to people who had never learned how to breathe on their own. You did it without asking for anything in return. You did it because it felt natural. You did it because you cared. But eventually, every human being reaches a limit. There comes a moment when the psyche recognizes that it has been giving more than it can sustain, a moment when exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore, a moment when the soul realizes that no amount of sacrifice can compensate for another person's refusal to grow. And when that moment arrives, something changes. You stop rescuing. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing. You stop carrying responsibilities that belong to others. Not because you have become cruel, but because you have finally understood an essential truth. No one can live another person's life for them. At some point, every individual must learn to stand alone, face themselves honestly, and begin the difficult work of building an inner foundation. That is the journey Jung called individuation. It is not glamorous. It is not easy. It often feels lonely, yet it is the path that leads to genuine freedom. Because the day you no longer need the crowd to tell you who you are is the day you begin to discover who you have been all along. Carl Jung described this phenomenon with a level of precision that few modern psychologists are willing to repeat today. He believed that within every human being there exists a profound, self-regulating mechanism, something he referred to as the transcendent function. This is not merely an abstract idea or a philosophical concept. It is a living process within the psyche, an inner intelligence that constantly works to restore balance between who you are and who you pretend to be. At certain moments in life, this function begins to operate independently of the conscious mind. It initiates movements, decisions, and transformations that the ego never consciously approved. One of the most powerful of these operations is the gradual withdrawal from parasitic environments. The remarkable part is that this withdrawal often does not feel like a choice. It feels as though something deeper inside you has made the decision long before your conscious mind catches up. You begin losing interest in places, conversations, and relationships that once seemed important. You feel resistance towards situations you used to tolerate effortlessly. It is not laziness. It is not arrogance. It is not social failure. It is the psyche protecting itself. That is why every time you force yourself to return to an environment that no longer aligns with your development, something inside you pays a price. When you ignore the signals of your body and attend gatherings you instinctively wanted to avoid, when you act as though nothing has changed within you, when you suppress the growing awareness that certain relationships are draining rather than nourishing, you often return home exhausted, not merely tired, but depleted, emptier than before, as if something invisible has been extracted from you. And in a sense, it has. Groups have their own psychological dynamics. This is not necessarily the result of malice. Most people are not consciously trying to exploit others. Yet every collective requires energy from its members to maintain itself. As long as you possess abundant emotional reserves, the exchange appears sustainable. You give your attention, your time, your emotional labor, your patience, your understanding, and you barely notice the cost. But eventually something changes. There comes a point when the psyche realizes it can no longer afford endless donations. The surplus disappears. What once felt natural begins to feel heavy. What once felt generous begins to feel self-destructive. This is where Jung's process of individuation becomes serious. And the word serious matters. Individuation is often portrayed as a beautiful spiritual journey filled with self-love, healing, and personal empowerment. But the reality is far less romantic. It demands rigor. It requires discipline. It means saying no where you once said yes. It means disappointing people who benefited from your compliance. It means losing relationships you believed would last forever. It means standing by your inner truth, even while fear shakes you from within. Few people talk about this side of transformation because it is not glamorous. There are no standing ovations for inner integrity. There are no awards for refusing to betray yourself. Society celebrates performance, not authenticity. It rewards spectacle, not psychological maturity. Yet this difficult phase contains one of the most fascinating observations ever documented in depth psychology. When an individual begins the process of genuine individuation, the surrounding environment often reacts before any visible action has been taken. People somehow sense the change. Before you have ended the relationship, before you have left the group, before you have spoken a single word, something shifts. Suddenly, individuals who have ignored you for months reach out unexpectedly. Family members become unusually concerned. Former friends attempt reconciliation. People who rarely offered support suddenly offer assistance. Old emotional ties reappear at precisely the moment you are preparing to move forward. To the untrained eye, these events appear coincidental. They rarely are. Psychologically speaking, systems tend to resist the loss of a member. Every group seeks stability. Every established pattern seeks preservation. The moment one person begins to evolve beyond their previous role, the system instinctively attempts to restore equilibrium. This is where most people turn back. They mistake the sudden appearance of affection for genuine transformation. They interpret temporary attention as lasting love. They assume the system has changed, when, in reality, it is simply trying to recover what it is losing. And so, they return. The extraction resumes. The cycle continues. But the individual who recognizes the pattern and endures the discomfort crosses a threshold. Beyond that threshold lies something the collective cannot provide. Biological sovereignty. Biological sovereignty means your nervous system no longer depends on external validation to generate a sense of worth. It means your emotional stability is no longer determined by approval, applause, likes, praise, invitations, or recognition. Your mind gradually learns to sustain itself. Your psychological chemistry becomes less dependent on social reinforcement. In a very real sense, you stop being addicted to belonging. The word addiction may sound harsh, but it accurately describes what often occurs. Compulsive social dependence activates many of the same reward mechanisms that drive other forms of dependency. It creates cravings. It develops tolerance. It generates anxiety when access is removed. It encourages repeated behaviors despite emotional cost. Many people are not searching for friendship. They are searching for a dose. And when the dose disappears, panic begins. The fear they call loneliness is often something else entirely. It is withdrawal, social withdrawal, emotional withdrawal, identity withdrawal. The discomfort is real, but like all forms of withdrawal, it is temporary. If you remain with it long enough, something remarkable happens. Your system slowly relearns how to generate peace from within. This is why the common advice to simply love your solitude is often ineffective. You cannot truly love something you do not yet understand. First, you must understand what solitude actually is. From a Jungian perspective, solitude is not punishment. It is a laboratory. It is the environment in which the individuated psyche is forged. Everything else in life is temporary. Possessions come and go. Status rises and falls. Relationships begin and end. Experiences fade into memory. But an individuated psyche becomes an enduring possession. Once formed, it cannot easily be taken away. This may explain why deeply individuated people possess a certain quality that others immediately notice. Jung often described mature individuals as having a kind of solidity, not emotional coldness, but structural strength. They resemble a mountain more than a performance. They do not constantly seek agreement. They do not require endless explanations. They do not need to convince others of their value. They simply exist. And that kind of presence affects people. Some admire it. Others resent it. Very few ignore it. The reason is simple. A truly individuated person unconsciously confronts others with a question. What parts of yourself are you still avoiding? Their existence becomes a mirror. That mirror can inspire growth, or it can provoke resistance. Now consider this honestly. How many of the people you no longer see genuinely contributed to your growth? And how many were simply organized noise? This is not a cynical question, it is a necessary one, because many human beings spend years confusing activity with meaning, company with connection, and familiarity with love. Another observation Jung made is equally important. Most people never complete the process of individuation, not because they lack the capacity, because they fear it. More specifically, they fear existing without witnesses. For the immature psyche, validation functions as proof of existence. If nobody is watching, who confirms that you matter? This question terrifies the undeveloped self. As a result, many people choose noise over silence. Not because they enjoy noise, because silence eventually forces them to meet themselves. And that encounter can be unsettling. At first, self-observation feels uncomfortable. It resembles seeing an unedited photograph of yourself. There are no filters, no flattering angles, no carefully constructed image, just reality. Yet, over time, something changes. Your own perception becomes more valuable than the opinions of others. You begin trusting your direct experience. You become less vulnerable to manipulation, less vulnerable to trends, less vulnerable to emotional blackmail. Your own gaze becomes the most reliable authority in your life. Everything else starts to feel secondary. This is one reason modern culture invests enormous resources in distraction. Constant stimulation prevents prolonged reflection. Endless entertainment prevents confrontation with deeper questions. Continuous connection prevents meaningful solitude. A person who spends enough time alone eventually begins thinking. A person who thinks begins questioning, and a person who questions becomes difficult to control. This is why conscious solitude possesses a quietly revolutionary quality. It returns ownership of attention. It returns ownership of thought. It returns ownership of the psyche. Social media, endless notifications, constant availability, and perpetual stimulation often keep people externally occupied while leaving them internally disconnected. The danger is not technology itself. The danger is never spending enough uninterrupted time with yourself to discover who you are without external input. When you choose silence over endless stimulation, you are reclaiming something fundamental. You are reclaiming your mind. You are reclaiming your attention. You are reclaiming your inner life. And once you see how much of modern existence depends on capturing those resources, it becomes impossible to look at things the same way again. Jung also noticed something remarkable about those who advanced deeply into individuation. They stopped rushing. Not ordinary productivity, not daily responsibilities, existential rushing, the desperate need to become someone, the desperate need to prove something, the desperate need to arrive. That urgency disappeared. In its place emerged a different relationship with time. Minutes felt fuller, experiences felt deeper, life became more inhabitable. The external clock continued moving at the same speed, yet the internal clock slowed down and expanded. Time stopped feeling like a creditor demanding payment. It became a space in which existence could unfold. This transformation is one of the clearest signs that something profound has changed within the psyche, and it almost always emerges through periods of genuine solitude. Constant company accelerates. Deep silence slows. Only through slowing down can a person fully perceive the totality of their own existence. This is why mystics, philosophers, and seekers throughout history repeatedly emphasized retreat and contemplation. They were not merely speaking in spiritual metaphors, they were describing psychological realities. To spend time alone is not necessarily to become a monk, a hermit, or an outsider. It is simply to participate in a natural process of psychological consolidation. It is to allow the psyche to complete work that cannot be accomplished amid constant noise. And when that work reaches maturity, it grants something extraordinary. Presence, real presence. The ability to be exactly where you are without needing someone else to confirm that you belong there. That may be the deepest freedom available to a human being. The freedom to exist without witnesses. And once you arrive there, a paradox emerges. You no longer reject people, but you no longer need them to complete you either. Those who enter your life are welcomed. Those who leave are released. Your emotional stability no longer rises and falls according to the behavior of others. And from that independence, something resembling genuine love finally becomes possible. You can care deeply without clinging. You can connect without dependency. You can give without begging. You can love without making another person responsible for your existence. That may be the closest thing to real love this world has to offer. Everything else is often a negotiation between two forms of emptiness, each hoping the other will provide what only inner development can create. Recognizing this truth requires courage, the kind of courage that very few people develop. But if you have followed this journey all the way here, perhaps that courage is already beginning to awaken within you. And that changes everything. You are not behind, you are not lost, and there is nothing wrong with you for feeling different from most people around you. What you are experiencing is not a mistake in your development, but a stage of growth that many people never allow themselves to enter. Most individuals spend their entire lives adapting to expectations, repeating inherited patterns, and seeking comfort in familiarity. Very few choose the difficult path of questioning who they really are beneath the roles they perform for others. The fact that you have stepped onto this path does not make you better than anyone else. It does not place you above those who are still living according to old habits or collective expectations. What it does is place a responsibility on your shoulders, a responsibility to protect what is being formed within you, a responsibility to honor the transformation that is taking place even when nobody around you understands it, a responsibility to resist the temptation to abandon your progress the moment an easier path appears. There will be moments when the desire to belong feels stronger than the desire to grow. There will be invitations back into familiar environments, familiar conversations, and familiar versions of yourself. The pull can be powerful because human beings naturally crave acceptance. We want to feel included, we want to feel understood, we want to feel connected to others. Yet there comes a moment in psychological development when belonging at any cost becomes too expensive. The temporary comfort of fitting in can demand the sacrifice of your authenticity. It can require you to shrink your awareness, silence your intuition, and ignore everything you have learned about yourself. Every time you betray your inner truth for the sake of approval, you pay a hidden price. The cost is not always visible immediately, but over time it accumulates as frustration, exhaustion, resentment, and a growing sense that you are living someone else's life. What is emerging within you deserves more respect than that. The sovereignty you are building cannot survive if it is constantly traded away for temporary validation. True individuality requires discipline. It requires the courage to stand alone when necessary. It requires the strength to remain loyal to your inner development even when external rewards seem absent. Your psyche is asking something important from you. It is asking for rigor. It is asking for consistency. It is asking you to take this process seriously. Not because life should become rigid or joyless, but because transformation demands commitment. The deeper parts of your mind are attempting to reorganize themselves. Old beliefs are being challenged. Old attachments are loosening. Old identities are dissolving. Such a process cannot be completed through half-hearted effort. Carl Jung often emphasized that becoming who you truly are is not a passive event. It is an active engagement with the deepest layers of the self. Individuation requires conscious participation. It requires honesty. It requires the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. It requires patience when progress seems invisible and trust when the road ahead appears uncertain. Many people abandon the journey because they mistake discomfort for failure. They assume that feeling isolated means they are moving in the wrong direction. They interpret confusion as evidence that something is broken. In reality, confusion is often a sign that old structures are collapsing to make room for something more authentic. The mind cannot enter a larger reality without first leaving a smaller one behind. As you continue forward, there will come a day when the pieces begin to fit together. The things that currently feel painful or confusing will reveal their purpose. The friendships that faded away, the habits you outgrew, the environments that no longer felt right, and the identities you were forced to release will suddenly make sense. You will realize that everything you left behind needed to be left behind. Not because those things were evil or worthless, but because they belonged to a version of yourself that could no longer contain who you were becoming. Growth often requires separation. Evolution often requires endings. The next chapter cannot fully emerge while you are still clinging to pages that have already been completed. When that understanding arrives, you will not spend your time mourning what was lost. You will feel gratitude for having the courage to let go. You will recognize that every difficult decision, every lonely moment, and every period of uncertainty was preparing you for a deeper relationship with yourself. This is one of the quiet promises hidden within the process of individuation. The path may feel lonely at times, but it is leading you toward wholeness. It is leading you toward a life that reflects your true nature rather than the expectations of others. It is leading you toward a level of psychological freedom that cannot be obtained through imitation or conformity. If these words resonate with you, perhaps it is because they have given language to something you have been experiencing in silence for a long time. Maybe you are only beginning to hear the call toward a more authentic life. Maybe you are in the middle of cutting ties with old patterns that no longer serve you. Or perhaps you have already crossed a significant threshold and simply needed someone to confirm what your intuition has known all along. Every stage of this journey carries its own challenges and its own lessons. No stage is superior to another. What matters is that you continue moving forward with awareness. What matters is that you remain honest about where you are and where your inner life is trying to lead you. Remember that many people around you may not understand what you are going through. They may interpret your changes as distance. They may see your boundaries as rejection. They may question decisions that make perfect sense to your evolving sense of self. Their confusion does not invalidate your experience. Sometimes people can only understand a transformation after it has already happened. There are others walking this path as well, even if you cannot always see them. There are people who are questioning old identities, releasing outdated beliefs, and learning how to build a life from a deeper center. Many of them feel isolated for the same reasons you do. Many of them are carrying insights that their environment cannot yet recognize. What often appears to be loneliness is actually transition. You are standing between who you were and who you are becoming. That space can feel uncertain, but it is also sacred. It is where the deepest changes take place. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: your nervous system is not broken, it is learning. For the first time, it may be developing the ability to distinguish between relationships that nourish your growth and relationships that drain your energy. It is learning to recognize the difference between environments that support your authenticity and environments that require you to abandon it. That distinction changes everything. As your awareness grows, you will become less interested in appearances and more interested in substance. Less interested in approval and more interested in truth. Less interested in being accepted by everyone and more interested in remaining aligned with yourself. From this point forward, that is the difference that matters. The people, habits, and experiences that nourish your spirit deserve your attention. The ones that continuously extract from you without supporting your growth deserve your distance. Everything else is noise.